Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson, and coming up on today's programme, we're going to be speaking to Afghanistan's permanent representative to the UN in Geneva. And amongst other things, I'll be discussing with him the latest hostilities between Kabul and Pakistan. Plus, the US Vice President JD Vance has been holding talks in Israel, where he's expressed optimism about President Trump's ceasefire plan for Gaza, saying it's going better than expected. I'll be asking our guests if they share his optimism. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the latest on the recent tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which have seen bloody border clashes between the two Asian countries. Well, these have been their deadliest hostilities since the return of the Taliban government in 2021. Well, Pakistan's Defence Minister, Khawaja Asif, has confirmed that a ceasefire deal has been reached, and the two sides will meet again on Saturday for further dialogue in Istanbul.
There's no timeline to it. We just extended it. There was no timeline that we'll watch till such and such date and then extend. It's we are at the moment we have a ceasefire agreement. As long there is no violation of the agreement, which is which is already in force. That is why we entered into an agreement. If there is no connivance, there is no sense in entering into agreement with TTA.
We're joined now by Ambassador Nasir Andisha, who is the permanent representative of Afghanistan to the UN in Geneva. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Dr. Andisha, you served as the Deputy Foreign Minister of Afghanistan during the period 2015 to 2019. You are a career diplomat and an academic, and you still hold the title of Permanent Representative of Afghanistan to the UN in Geneva. But just to avoid any confusion amongst our viewers, you do not represent the Taliban in any way, do you?
No, thank you very much. First of all, greeting to you and to all audiences. Yes, as you all know, that the Taliban are not recognized officially, internationally. So in the international system, particularly within the United Nations system, Afghanistan as a state still is represented by the formal ambassadors and representatives who have been given their credentials before the military takeover of the country by the Taliban. So we do represent the people of Afghanistan and the democratic and free aspiration of people of Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, it's been 4 years since that chaotic scene of people fleeing Afghanistan, the American troops pulling out. And I'd just like to ask you, I mean, what is your assessment of how things have been going in your country since then?
I think what we can quickly describe it, because there is a lot of history behind this and we don't have time for that. But I think a peace process which was probably not comprehensive enough, not taking into account all the regional and the domestic stakeholders went wrong. A peace process went wrong. A peace process which did not look after, as I said, the interests of people of Afghanistan, women, educated and progressive communities who, work for 20 years to make Afghanistan, as a place that can live in peace with itself and its neighbor, and with its own Islamic identity, but also can join the progress in and around that part of the world. But also there was this rivalries within the regional and international stakeholders, which is now we can see it. Maybe later on we can discuss about it. It's coming back in terms of Pakistan and Taliban rivalry and also some sort of a regional thing. So the Doha process, to tell you, became a disaster. The Doha peace agreement or the Doha agreement between the United States and the Taliban. And it turned out that it just, completely handed over Afghanistan in the plate to a very extremist Islamist group, which, later on did not comply with some of the points that they agreed in Doha and seized the country militarily. And ever since, dismantling all the progress, all the institutions, women's rights, human rights, education, parliament, just name it, free trade, free expression, and turning this country with a very sort of, medieval ideological approach toward, unfortunately, Islam, because that's not true, because, the OIC and no Islamic countries and endorse their policies, is taking Afghanistan back to the Stone Age, where it's becoming a laughing stock everywhere around the world. I'm dealing with different embassies and ambassadors from Latin America. They're asking, which kind of people are leading, your country in this 21st century. So I think that's basically what happened. But ever since, there is a total confusion in and out within the region that what to do with this group. Some people think that they could be a strategic asset, in the regional rivalries. Some people think that they could be, an agent of change, which I think increasingly we are finding out that they are not. But then some countries who thought they could be strategic tools for regional rivalry is turning around. For example, now what happens is that the Taliban, the first country that they're actively fighting is Pakistan, which, in many years, Pakistan supported them and provided them with logistics. And, former Prime Minister Imran Khan called them, freedom fighters who broke the shackles of imperialism and things like this. So I think it's, we are dealing with a phenomena of Taliban, which does not represent the reality of Afghanistan. And this, for me, is heartening that sometimes, some of the media channels, particularly in the Arab world, is putting them as, the government of Afghanistan. Like there's a ceasefire between Afghanistan and Pakistan. But to us, they are similar to the Houthis. Nobody said there is a ceasefire between Yemen or, let's say, Oman. They say there's a ceasefire between the Houthis. And I think, I urge the viewers, I urge people, in the Arab world to understand that, Taliban is just a group, and that's not Afghanistan. Afghanistan is much larger, much bigger, much diverse than what Taliban are and what Taliban represent.
Okay, Ambassador, I mean, you've raised a lot of important points there. Let's talk then a bit about the hostilities between Afghanistan and Pakistan. I mean, the two countries share a long border. It's 2,600 kilometers in length. Just tell us, what is the situation as far as you understand it right now on that border?
You see, that's the irony. The irony is that in Afghanistan and Pakistan, ever since the creation of Pakistan, we had some differences, particularly around this borderline, and also, in terms of the sort of the colonial legacy which was left in many places in the Middle East and South Asia. But this recent episode is ironic because the Taliban were basically brought in the Pakistani madrasas and seminaries. They were trained, they were supported, and in the past 20 years, they're fighting against, the legitimate government of Afghanistan, democratic government of Afghanistan, but also international coalition, UN and everybody else. The Taliban were supported, and there was some sort of an understanding within some groups in Pakistan, particularly in the military and some of the extremist groups, that a government in which there is Taliban is strongly presented, or a government by Taliban, will be one of the best policy options for them. But the way it's turning out is that since the Taliban themselves were an amalgamation of a different terrorist groups, because in their first stint in Afghanistan, in 1996 to 2001, they actually gave base to Al-Qaeda. We know that, Bin Laden was there, Al-Zawahiri was killed. And then most of these international terrorist groups, they find refuge among the Taliban. And when they were also the NATO and international coalition was fighting against them. So these groups have allegiances with the Taliban, including regional ones like Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, the Ansarullah, but the major, and the Chinese ETIM, Al-Qaeda, different groups of Al-Qaeda, but the major link was between the Taliban of Pakistan, TTP, and this Taliban, because they are kind of, friends and cousins to some extent. So the idea for Pakistan was that once the Taliban come into power, and they will also dash Indians' presence in Afghanistan, what we can do is we can, get rid of this group, both the Baluch group, which threatened Pakistan, but also the TTP, which is mostly Pashtun Taliban. But that didn't happen. And instead of that, the level of hostilities, the level of attacks, the casualties of the Pakistani army increased almost 250-fold. It means that, during the NATO, during the previous government, it was much lower than what it is right now. And this was not what Pakistan expected it. So, and then Pakistan also had credible evidence that where these people are, because there was a negotiation between the Pakistan and the TTP in Afghanistan. So I think they reached a point where they wanted to take matter in their own hand. And they started attacking Afghanistan directly, which is very unfortunate. In our history of 76 years of Pakistan, we never had a Pakistani plane crossing the border lines, coming into the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul, but also main cities like Kandahar and Jalalabad. So I think it increased the level of hostility into a level where the Taliban started fighting back. But it's it's a very, very sad situation. I think it's a situation where Pakistan is sort of caught in a situation where the people they thought are the liberators are now becoming their enemy number one.
Okay, so clearly there is a risk here, isn't there, of further escalation given the situation we're in. There is a ceasefire. Talks are ongoing. There'll be more talks during the course of the coming days. Do you think there is a risk here of an all-out conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan? And were that to happen, how do you think Afghanistan would fare?
First of all, again, I will re-emphasize that Afghanistan is not fighting Pakistan because, it's actually the Taliban who are fighting it for their own interest. And that is because they cannot ideologically hand over or get rid of this TTP, Tehrik Taliban Pakistan. The interesting thing was that during this, Doha negotiation, Taliban promised to the United States that Afghanistan's soil will not be used against the interest of any other countries. And also the terrorist groups in Afghanistan will be gradually dismantled and handed over. But the reality is that the Taliban's DNA is in such a way that it's actually, there's very symbiotic relationship between them and the other groups. So they cannot, they cannot fight against them, or they do not have the willing and the ideology to fight. So I'm thinking that the war will not escalate into that level because Taliban does not have neither the capacity nor the weapon nor the technology, nothing. To face sort of a conventional war with Pakistan. And Pakistan actually does not need to go to that level of conventional war. And because Taliban is not a legitimate system, they do not represent people, they don't have a shura, they don't have a parliament, or all the ethnic groups of the country, they cannot raise the national sentiment, which was always the asset of the Afghan people throughout the centuries fighting, either British or the Russians or all of, this sort of jihads that we had. This time Taliban, because they came from Pakistan, they cannot, bring people to start fighting with their, with the Pakistanis. So I think what will happen is that this ceasefire has created what we call it, maybe a terminology, sort of a punitive deterrence, a policy of punitive deterrence by Pakistan. And this punitive deterrence is in a way that, look, if there is an attack originated from Afghanistan by the Pakistani Taliban on the Pakistani soil, we will retaliate against the hideouts of these terrorists inside Afghanistan. So which means we have a ceasefire with Taliban. We are not going to fight the Taliban, but we will go against the TTP in their hideouts. So it's, and that's why, this agreement, which was initially negotiated in Doha last week, and now I think the details will be negotiated in Turkey, in Istanbul or Ankara, I don't know. But so it's actually bringing both Turkey and Qatar into the mix as two countries which will monitor this ceasefire. But Pakistanis have made it clear that this ceasefire is not with the TTP. It's with the TTA, Tariq Taliban Afghanistan, but not with the Pakistanis.
Okay.
So I think what Pakistan has created, a kind of a situation, and a status quo in which they have given a free hand for themselves now with the verification of Turkey and Qatar probably that they could be able to go after the TTP. And the Taliban, I don't know how they can comply with this article that we will not let Afghanistan soil to be used by TTP or the other terrorist groups, because in reality they don't have neither the willingness nor the capacity. So I could see a long-term sort of strategy in which Taliban will be capitulating to some of the demands of Pakistan, but on the other hand, their internal fissure will widen, because one group of Taliban, they really don't want to give up TTP.
Okay, well, in Pakistan, there is a suspicion that India is somehow involved in what's going on behind the scenes. There are accusations that even come from the Pakistani defense minister, who says that Kabul acts like a proxy of India, he says. Those are his words. There's also talk about India perhaps opening an embassy in Kabul. What do you make of this? What do you make of the idea that somehow, at least in Pakistan's mind, India is fanning the flames here to a certain extent with these tensions between Kabul and Islamabad?
I think that's the irony, and probably this is the biggest disappointment for the establishment in Pakistan, who thought that with Taliban being sort of a fundamentalist, extremist Islamist, but also closely related to them, of the Southern Pashtun community, they might have an upper hand when it comes to future dispensation in Kabul, but the tables has turned. And that is, I think that's what makes Pakistan also very, very upset to look at this kind of situation where the Taliban foreign minister, Muttaqi, is learning Urdu in Pakistan, but actually is using it when he goes and talks to the Indians in India. I think that allegation between India and Pakistan has always been in Afghanistan. I think it's not a new thing. Even during the previous government, the Pakistanis sometimes say that India has, I don't know, more than 20 consulates in Afghanistan, which was not true. But we all know. I mean, it's not hidden. I mean, this is an open secret like now that there are sort of covert operations and covert against each other in both India and Pakistan. But the important thing is that now it's becoming very overt. With Taliban ideologically being 180 degree on the other side of a very sort of Hindu BJP RSS-led government in Delhi. So it's somehow it seems that there is an alignment of right-wingers for their own interests. So I think that's it's not only now Taliban are not hiding this, but Taliban are making this very, very open. And that's which is the biggest disaster for Afghanistan, is that at the end of the day, it's not about Afghanistan. It's not about future of Afghanistan. It's about that how groups could be used. So when a group is controlling, when a group which is not accountable to its own people like Taliban, they can be so reckless to enter into the fray of India, Pakistan, and given sufficient evidence for the Pakistanis also to raise the public sentiment against Afghanistan and against their involvement. As far as the Indian embassy is concerned, I mean, of course, Taliban are not a legitimate government, but we as a state have the right to have, embassies of all the neighboring and regional countries open in our own country. But the reality is that has not to be turned into, a base for rivalries, because the history of Afghanistan always have been, the source of conflict when either the Russian opened an embassy and the British Empire got upset, or it was, the British Empire came from the south and Russians got, upset. So I think we in Afghanistan need to have a neutral and economically integrated country where the interest of all countries could be kept balanced. And our neutrality has to be kept. Because at this stage, We are not neutral. Afghanistan is not neutral. Taliban are certainly not neutral vis-a-vis Pakistan.
Okay, we haven't got much time left, so let's move on to perhaps one final question to talk about sort of the general situation in Afghanistan as you understand it. We get lots of reports about what life is like for women. They can no longer practice many professions, many curtailments on their liberty. We're also told that social media faces quite a lot of restrictions in Afghanistan as well. I'm just wondering what you make of those reports about restrictions on social media in Afghanistan. Why do you think such restrictions are in place, and what do they mean for, in particular, young Afghans who one would have thought would be quite sort of adept and quite keen on using social media?
I think on the situation of human rights, I'm here, for the past 4 years, and one of the major battlegrounds that we are really fighting for is the basics, the fundamentals of human rights of the people of Afghanistan to be restored. Because in the words of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Afghanistan is the worst place for women and young children, especially for girls, because the education, their employment, their work, the basic freedoms has curtailed in a way that now many UN reports defining it as something like a gender apartheid. I mean, if you can bring the apartheid together with gender, so this is what the situation in Afghanistan is. And that's why recently, in this month, beginning of this month, we had a new independent investigative mechanism on the situation of Afghanistan. So the ICC has indicted Taliban leaders. I think in terms of the situation of human rights, this is one of the worst, one of the darkest places. And that also includes not only rights to education, rights to free media, rights to access to just very basics of life. And recently, the Taliban, of course, very cleverly using social media and, media in the past for their own benefits. But now that they have come to power, they understand that, people of Afghanistan, especially the younger generation, the educated one, they wanted to use internet also for their education. There were a lot of girls' universities and schools online and under the ground. So they have curbed now internet in that way, but also they are putting a lot of pressure on whatever is remaining from Afghanistan's media. And they are using all these, tactics to pressure anybody who will have, just an open, to use social media as an open forum. For example, one example is that, when there was attacks in Kabul, because the attacks happened in different parts, and so they did not allow anyone. So there was no actually video of any of these attacks coming out, and they actually for 24 hours or 48 hours, Taliban, the spokesperson, were denying that there was attack. They said it was a tanker. It was an oil tanker which bursted or burned. But in reality was that it was drones attack. So I think a Taliban, like many of these, like North Korea and the others, they think that, by curbing, by controlling social media, they can, maintain some sort of cohesion among their own people. But I think they are wrong, because majority of people of Afghanistan are now younger people. They are very well connected, and they wanted to know what's happening in the country, and they wanted to inform the rest of the world that, Afghanistan is a closed prison, but we still want to fight, for our freedom, for basics, the basics which the world and also our neighborhood has.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time, but it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. Ambassador Nasir Andisha, thank you very much indeed for speaking to Arabiya English.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Now turning our attention to the Middle East, where the US Vice President JD Vance has been holding talks with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. This on the second day of his trip to the country. Well, the Vice President's visit is part of a broader diplomatic push for the US-led plan to end the fighting, secure the release of hostages and begin rebuilding Gaza. Well, Vice President Vance warned, however, that disarming Hamas will be no easy task.
This thing takes monitoring, and it's going to take a lot of work. I was in the CMCC, which we opened up yesterday. A lot of our Israeli friends working together with a lot of Americans to actually mediate this entire ceasefire process, to get some of the critical infrastructure off the ground, from the international security force to some of the reconstruction of Gaza. It's not easy. I never said it was easy, but what I am is optimistic that the ceasefire is going to hold and that we can actually build a better future in the entire Middle East.
Meanwhile, funeral prayers were held today at the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis in Gaza. This after Israel sent back 54 bodies of Palestinians to the Gaza Strip. Well, this brings the total number of bodies handed over under the ceasefire deal to 195. That's according to the Gaza Health Ministry. Well, under the deal brokered by the US President Donald Trump, Israel was to return the bodies of 15 Palestinians for every deceased Israeli who was returned. Well, the Palestinian authorities accuse Israel of mistreating and killing some of those in its custody. Well, we're joined now by Calvin Dark, who is a global affairs analyst who joins us now from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Arabiya English. Let's start by talking about what's been happening in Israel in particular today. The ceasefire began 12 days ago with Gaza. JD Vance, the US Vice President, is there. What do you think he's seeking to achieve on his visit to Israel?
Thank you for having me. I think it's helpful to understand that just traditionally, the role of the vice president has been when the president wants to show that he's serious, but when it's something he doesn't want to do and there's not going to be any real developments, they send the vice president. And in that, Donald Trump is like his predecessors. JD Vance had one goal and has one goal in Israel, and that is to communicate a series of messages around the ceasefire and around America's role going forward. I think that the first message, he said this a lot during his press conference yesterday with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, despite the criticisms, despite the naysayers, that the ceasefire is strong and will hold while acknowledging the difficulties. I think that that was a message to some of the opposition around the world in the United States that maybe it's not the 3,000-year peace that Donald Trump described it as. I also think there was another message that was interesting to an American audience. If you'll notice, JD Vance talked about the role of the United States. I believe he said we're the only mediator, really, that can pull all of the parties together to maintain a ceasefire. Yet that will not entail American soldiers on the ground, and the role of the group of soldiers that are in that region, he downplayed, saying that was just normal, but they won't be in Gaza. That was really important because there is growing angst in Donald Trump's base in the United States because they want the victory. They want to be able to talk about the ceasefire and the Trump peace, but they don't want the follow through because the follow through in the Middle East from the United States points of view generally is a decades-long war. And so JD Vance was trying to reassure Trump's base in the United States that although America is the leader in bringing this peace, it won't look like Afghanistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the list goes on. So I think bringing home those messages was JD Vance's main goal.
Right, and this is all, of course, 10 days or so since President Trump himself was there. So perhaps keeping momentum alive by sending his vice president as well. And we heard JD Vance saying that, this ceasefire deal is going, he said, better than expected. He said, quote, "I feel very optimistic based on the conversations we've had here and with our Gulf Arab friends. I think we can make peace stick," he said. I mean, do you share that same level of optimism?
I would say cautious optimism. And I think that represents the consensus in the United States. Yes, there's opposition to Donald Trump, but I think the consensus in the United States is we wanted an end to the war, a return of the prisoners and hostages, the beginning of the end of the humanitarian crisis. But we're also realistic in the United States that this isn't going to be solved in a week, in a month. And we know that Donald Trump is not one who deals in nuance. Everything is always the best, the biggest, the final, permanent. And while JD Vance may understand that that is hardly the case in this particular instance, he is there to carry Donald Trump's message. And that is why you see this optimism that sometimes kind of glosses over very real questions about the second stage of this peace deal.
Right. So you seem to be suggesting that, in fact, the next stage is going to be perhaps the harder part of implementing this ceasefire deal.
Yes, and I think that the majority of the legitimate criticisms of this process from the United States are the fact that if you look at the 20-point plan, there aren't details. And it doesn't seem as if the current efforts focus on the problem at the root of the issue. And even though those are mentioned, like I think there's vague language on a path to aspirations of statehood, several layers of diplomatic language, where are the details? Because there have been ceasefires in the past. The problem has been, how do we address those underlying issues? How do we address the very real current facts on the ground about there's a return of the Palestinians to Gaza, but return to what? And who is going to make sure that that doesn't turn into another humanitarian crisis? Is the United States, for example, the right mediator between the parties? Or are they there to execute what Netanyahu and Israel want? A lot of legitimate questions with not a lot of details in the answers. And I think that's the base of a lot of the skepticism we have in the United States.
President Trump sounds quite understanding and accommodating on certain issues. Notably, he sounds more understanding than the Israelis do on this issue of repatriating the remains of the deceased hostages. And he said, he can imagine, or words to that effect, it's very difficult to locate them amidst all the rubble. And he's demonstrated a little bit more flexibility on that issue. I mean, Israel's considerably less flexible on this. Do you think this is a reflection of President Trump's desire to make sure that this plan does not collapse, that this ceasefire deal remains in place?
I think it's an indicator that Donald Trump realizes what I and a lot of the world realize, that Netanyahu is going to look for any way he can to not comply with the principles behind this deal if it is not what he believes is good for Israel. And Donald Trump understands that if, for example, with the return of the bodies, yes, that's a part of this first stage. And yes, Netanyahu, even threatened to stop the restarted humanitarian aid because of it. And Donald Trump understands that it's not because Netanyahu doesn't understand that there is a logistical, practical issue with it. Trump understands he's going to look for any way to manipulate the deal to his advantage. And so I think that's why we see this flexibility from Trump's part, in that he now owns this piece. And by owning this piece, he also owns it if it breaks. And he knows what Netanyahu wants to do. So when it comes to this issue of returning of the bodies, he himself said, JD Vance said, there are logistical concerns. There are even issues about, can Hamas even get the tools that Israel wasn't letting in to do what they're supposed to do in the first part of the agreement. And I do have to say that is something I think Donald Trump should be applauded for, because most presidents in the past hadn't been willing to call out what we all see. And I think the fact that he said, hey, we need to be flexible on this because this is a logistical problem, not just because Hamas isn't committed to this deal.
And Calvin, obviously, you're across this issue. You've been across Middle Eastern affairs for a long time, and there is sometimes speculation about the state of relations between U.S. presidents and Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's been here for a very long time. And obviously, at the moment, Israel looking quite isolated on the international stage. A lot of shock and anger about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Do you think there are tensions at the moment? Do you detect any signs of friction between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu?
I think between President Trump and Netanyahu, there have been friction because we know that Donald, for good or bad, Donald Trump's motivation is, how does he appear in this particular situation? And we saw that when it seemed that what Netanyahu was doing was standing in the way of Donald Trump's aspirations to be the deal maker, to get the prize, sometimes the literal prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, he stands up against him. But we also know that, I think at the heart of the issue, Donald Trump wants to have good relations with Netanyahu because there's a political advantage in it. And as you mentioned, like the kind of sometimes optimism, you kind of wonder where it's coming from. Let's remember, the day after a ceasefire went into effect, Donald Trump said in the U.S., Israel was isolated on the world stage, but now that's over. Everybody loves Israel again. I think that's a sign of Donald Trump trying to speak it into existence, kind of optimism. And so I think we will see more of that because he wants the relations to improve, or at least appear improved. The problem is that they're deep in the United States and that it goes beyond Netanyahu and Donald Trump. There's damage to Israel's reputation, particularly its political weight in the United States, I think, for at least a generation. And I don't think a successful ceasefire or even a successful second stage is going to really change that in the near future.
One of the things that, obviously there are a lot of challenges facing the Trump administration with regards to the situation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But one of them is, of course, the growing or the broadening of the Abraham Accords. And on the one hand, President Trump wants to do that. And on the other hand, the states that are yet to sign up to the Abraham Accords have made their positions extremely clear. For example, on the issue of Palestinian statehood. And then we've heard Prime Minister Netanyahu saying when the ink wasn't even dry on the 20-point plan, well, that's never going to happen, or words to that effect. How does President Trump reconcile those two things and bring the Abraham Accords forward, grow them, which is something he wants to do, and at the same time manage Netanyahu's expectations?
I thought a lot about this issue because, I'm here in Washington, D.C., but I actually divide my time between Washington, D.C. and Rabat. And so I'm always looking at that as Morocco is one of the countries in the Abraham Accords. What's the future of that post the war in Gaza? I think that, once again, Donald Trump is optimistic because he believes this is something that he can achieve that no other president has achieved, and it would be unprecedented. I also believe that Donald Trump thinks that those obstacles that have stood in the way of normalization with Israel and other countries in the region is because people are making it more complicated than it has to be. I don't think Donald Trump realizes that he doesn't think at the end of the day, the very, very fixed positions on the issue of Israel-Palestine from the cultural, religious, political standpoint are really that important if there is money in the mix. And I say that because I believe Donald Trump thinks that, for decades, people have said it's an intractable position. One side says there has to be a Palestinian state. One side says that's absolutely not in the cards. But if there is investment, if there is prosperity, if there's a chance to be a big partner with the United States, people might change their tune because at the end of the day, he's a businessman and he thinks that money is at the heart of any deal that's going to last. I think that's a lot more complicated than that, but I think that's Donald Trump's bet that he's making, that if he's able to secure this investment, this security cooperation, military cooperation, that maybe people won't see it as intractable as they had figuring out what to do between Israel and Palestine.
Just lastly, Calvin, and briefly, if you don't mind, I mean, do you see President Trump succeeding where 14 US presidents, that's the 14 presidents since Israel was established in 1948, do you see him succeeding where those 14 have failed?
Overall, I want him to succeed because I believe that's good for the region and good for America. I am realistic, though, that I don't think Donald Trump has the tools for success, meaning a team that's dedicated with a plan, with details, and a president that's dedicated to the follow-up, not just the peace ceremony. If he can get those things, then I think he has a really good chance, but it's going to be an uphill battle.
All right, we really appreciate you sharing that with us. Calvin Dark, Global Affairs Analyst, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you.
Well, I'm joined here in the studio by Greg Swenson, who is the chair of Republicans Overseas and a friend of the show. Welcome to the program. Welcome to our studios.
Great to be here.
We usually see you down the barrel of the cameras. It's nice to have you with us here. Let's start by talking about the Vice President JD Vance. He's obviously been in Israel this week, holding talks there. We're about 12 days into the ceasefire in Gaza. What do you think JD Vance is seeking to achieve on this trip?
I think there's a few things. One is starting to work on phase two, and I think there was a lot of questions about that because there wasn't much detail. They just said we have to work on phase two. So that's number one. And number two is, I think, just demonstrating the commitment from the United States. You had President Trump here only 9 days ago, and that was, quite a moment for America, quite a moment for the world. And I think JD Vance coming, only 8 days later or a week later is a good sign that we're serious about this. And there are going to be some speed bumps, and we've seen them already with, a couple of the ceasefire violations. So I think it's important that he's got a presence here.
Sure, that's a lot of momentum, isn't it? The US president one week, the vice president the following week. So clearly they don't want anyone to drop the ball. And it was interesting what Vance said. He said the ceasefire deal is going better than anyone had expected. He thinks the peace is going to stick. Are you as optimistic as he is?
Yeah, I'm pretty confident. I think this, I mean, I hate to say this time it's different, but I do think it's not only the commitment from the United States, it was the fact that they put a coalition together with the Arab and Gulf countries, and that was really important. So I think with given the commitment from the neighbors, I think it's much more likely to work than not work at this point. Now, again, not without some speed bumps or some hiccups, and we've seen some already. I think it's important that the vice president is here, and Jared Kushner was even saying, to both Netanyahu and to Hamas, okay, let's dial it down a bit.
It's interesting. I mean, I want to get your interpretation whether you think perhaps President Trump is a little bit more, shall we say, flexible with Hamas than certainly the Israelis are, and perhaps he might have been in under different circumstances. Because, for example, on the issue of repatriating the remains of the deceased hostages, he sounds quite understanding of Hamas's predicament here. How do you find deceased hostages under tons and tons of rubble? Of rubble and tunnels, this massive tunnel network they have. I think he is a bit more flexible. The most important thing was the hostages that were returned alive. That was critical to kick off the ceasefire. But I do think he understands there might be some difficulties, and he's just got to measure, what's most important. I don't think, he encouraged Netanyahu to have a measured response or a reciprocal response, and not go overboard with that. It's difficult, right? I think the message that President Trump sent was, go ahead, Israel, and eliminate or do your best to eliminate Hamas. And then he came along with the peace deal during that process. But it was that effort by the IDF to weaken Hamas that made the peace deal possible. And he's also said on numerous occasions, you have to disarm, and if you don't, we'll disarm you. So, I think he's like in many situations, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And I think having, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, notice these three real estate people got the deal done, not, career diplomats. So it's classic President Trump. There's a lot of speculation about the nature of the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I mean, I know this would be pure speculation on your part, but let me ask you anyway. Do you think sometimes there's a bit of exaggeration, perhaps in the media and pundits, about, the occasional spat between the two men? Do you think it's perhaps inevitable, given the stakes, there would be some tensions?
Yeah, I think any media speculation on difficulties that they're having are greatly exaggerated. I think the president has a staunch commitment to Israel, so much different than President Biden or even candidate Kamala Harris or Vice President Kamala Harris. So it's night and day from the last administration, and I think Netanyahu knows that. And again, there's going to be some minor disagreements. Remember when he was getting on Marine One 6 months ago and used an obscenity because he was frustrated. And so it doesn't mean that there won't be some minor disagreements, but that commitment to Israel and basically given permission for him to eliminate Hamas and the Houthis and Hezbollah, and also IDF did a phenomenal job on sort of beating up on Iran before the final B-2 airstrikes from the U.S. So, they basically took out their air defenses. So, yeah, their relationship is super solid.
Okay, before we move on to the next topic, just briefly, this issue of peace in the Middle East, it's eluded 14 U.S. presidents since Israel was established in 1948. Do you think President Trump is going to be the one that gets this done?
I think he will be the one. He is all about outcomes. He's unorthodox, he's unconventional, he's just so different than any other president. And so I think it's going to work.
Okay, let's move on to some other talks that President Trump was going to hold with this time the Russian President Vladimir Putin, talks that were going to be hosted in Budapest. They're now not going to happen. President Trump saying he didn't want a wasted meeting. Yeah. What do you read into that?
He's got a point. I mean, they've sort of drawn the line in the sand and said they don't want to just draw the line, and agree on to just take the territory that they've accomplished or taken so far. They want more. And I think that's really sort of obnoxious. And I think he's frustrated with Putin. And, he did the whole Alaska summit, really reached out to Putin, hoping that they could do something together and achieve peace. And it's Putin that's the wild card in this whole thing. So that is frustrating to the president. He surely doesn't want to do waste another trip to Europe or anywhere to see Putin if it's not going to lead to anything. I think they have to make a concession first before the president will agree to sit down again.
So what you're saying is that President Trump feels that he has extended every courtesy to President Putin, and he just hasn't been seeing any reciprocity.
Absolutely. I mean, it's amazing that Ukraine, that Zelensky agreed immediately to the proposal that the president made. That's not something I would have expected Zelensky agree to a year or two ago. And I think the president has gotten, he's done a good job of getting Zelensky to the right point, but Putin is really failing in this situation, and I think that's really frustrating for the president.
Do you think President Trump feels like President Zelensky has done pretty much everything that could reasonably be expected from him?
I think he has. I think, in spite of the rough moment in the Oval Office, those difficult 13 minutes after 40 minutes of diplomacy, but followed by 13 minutes of chaos. Other than that, I think Zelensky's been really cooperative. And I think, Zelensky knows that it's a stalemate. There's probably little chance that they'll ever win, but it's just a long stalemate. And they've known that for 2 years now.
There were some rumors, again, reports unsubstantiated, that there was a bit of a shouting match on Friday when President Zelensky and President Trump had their talks. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't. Speculation.
All right.
Yeah.
Obviously, President Trump's European allies will tell him things in their way. They will say President Putin isn't serious about peace. They'll say the fighting should stop before any negotiations take place. Who do you think President Trump listens to most in Europe?
I would say Giorgia Meloni. That's a really good relationship. There's a real respect for her. She was actually respected by the Biden White House as well. So she's done a good job managing Washington. And I think that's, not that she can really move the needle on this, but she's been a staunch defender of Ukraine from the get-go.
What do you think he likes
really consistent with the MAGA, by every other measure, she is about as MAGA, Republican or MAGA right-wing as you would expect, and maybe after Orban. But I do think that there's a great relationship there because she's really leading the charge in Europe from this new populist right. She's a proud Italian, a proud Christian, a proud mother, proud woman. So and she leads with that, and so you're seeing. AfD in Germany and Vox in Spain and National Front in France and of course Reform in the UK, all following the lead. So she's really the first one of Western Europe anyway to achieve political success, and I think you're going to see more of that in the West.
Okay, and the last topic I wanted to talk to you about quickly is the shutdown. We're about 3 weeks in now to the government shutdown in the United States. I mean, what's the mood in Washington? Because, a lot of people won't have been paid.
Yeah.
This is going to start hurting the economy, isn't it?
I don't think it will hurt the economy. In the last two big shutdowns in the last 15 years, it did ultimately hurt the economy, but in a minor way. It was kind of a sliver. You had some layoffs at some of the defense contractors, for example. So if the government's not paying, they can't pay Lockheed Martin or Raytheon. So you could see some layoffs in defense, but. More importantly, is President Trump's trying to find the money to pay the military. Now, of course, the Democrats will oppose that because they want to pay, their agencies and their welfare state agencies. But 70% of the government is operating, so it's not really affecting people. Unless you want to go to a national park, those are shut down. Other than that, the government's functioning. So you have this moment where and I think this is why it will backfire on the Democrats. You have this term called essential jobs. So essential jobs will continue, and they have been. The military is still operating. We need to find some paychecks for them. But, okay, well then why do we even have the non-essential jobs, right? Let's get back to smaller government. So the president is taking advantage of that. I think you'll see significant layoffs. The only part of the economy it'll damage, Tom, is around Washington, D.C., where the federal bureaucracy is just so bloated. So that will hurt the local economy. Other than that, I think it's game on. Let's get rid of some of these non-essential workers permanently, and then get the focus back on the private sector.
I went on the NASA website the other day and I saw that that's not being updated in light of the shutdown. So some impact there. Just briefly, any end in sight, do you think, to this shutdown?
I think now that the weekend protests are over, there might be. I think that it all depends on the messaging and how the polling is going. Now, President Trump is actually up a point. I know it's only a point, but the last shutdown, he was down 3 points because of the shutdown. So I think he's got some staying power here. the Democrats are the ones that are shutting down the government. They just have to, I think the Republicans have to do a better job of messaging that. The House passed the continuing resolution. 53 senators, Republican senators, have signed off on it, and even a handful of Democrat senators, including Fetterman from Pennsylvania, who's turned out to have a real independent streak. But I do think it's the Senate Democrats that are holding this up. And so this isn't the Republicans blocking legislation, this is the Democrats. And I think if that comes across to the people, that they'll have to buckle at some point.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much
here,
indeed,
Tom.
Greg Swenson, Chair of Republican Overseas. Thank you very much indeed for coming to see us.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.